Watch this video if you want to see a huge Russian imperial project that could have been realized if the Russians had shown competence in World War I. This would be a difficult task. This is how the preparation of most Russian soldiers went. Hey, come here. You're in the army now. But I have no training. Don't worry, we'll give you everything you need in a few minutes. We don't have a rifle for you to practice with, so just imagine this broomstick is a rifle. The next day, well, you are adequately prepared. Here are some cartridges. Now go find the dead soldier, take his rifle and use it as instructed. This is no exaggeration. This is how many Russian soldiers met their fate in the Great War. I read about this in Douglas Bowe's book on the October Revolution, which contains a large section on the Great War. I will rely on this source, so if something is wrong, inform Douglas Bowe, not me. The lack of preparation was not the only problem for the Russian army during World War I. You may be surprised to learn how incompetent the Russians were, and especially Tsar Nicholas II himself. As a result, making Russia more competent would be quite difficult, and we would have to change a lot for it to succeed. But it is still possible. Let us not forget that Russia achieved military victories, lost millions of people, suffered from famine, had a provisional government, endured a communist revolution, and a civil war. Fixing the situation in Russia and preventing these problems would not be easy, but I have enough information to propose a quite plausible solution. I will consider the problems one by one and suggest how to solve them. By the end of this chapter, we should have a Russian giant capable of conquering the entire world, or at least half of the Central Powers. Let's see how a competent Russia could change the course of the World War. The biggest problem for the country was Nicholas II, who, as you might have noticed, was extremely incompetent. But when you delve into the details, it gets even worse. For example, this is how the Tsar lived in February 1917. Before the February Revolution that brought Alexander Kerensky and his provisional government to power. Your Majesty, we have serious problems. Society is collapsing. Basic goods cost a fortune. We are losing the war, and I had to sell my wife to buy food. You need to establish a constitutional monarchy. Oh, look what I found. It's dominoes. You need to place 2 black circles next to each other and continue as long as you can. But Your Majesty, we need your help to fix the country. I will join later. I am more interested in playing dominoes right now than participating in a war where we are losing millions of men. This shows how indifferent Nicholas II was to governing the country. It all worsened in 1905 when a mass revolution occurred due to Russia's defeat in the war with Japan. Nicholas II refused to establish a constitutional monarchy and created something like a parliament that could vote. Tsar Nicholas II, despite lacking legislative powers, sought authority but handled this task extremely poorly. I believe that the best solution for Russia would be to become a constitutional monarchy. In 1905, I approached Nicholas II and said, "Listen, you need to liberalize the country, otherwise I will end my life before your eyes." As a result, Nicholas II promised to carry out reforms but ultimately did not fulfill most of his promises. These were just empty words to calm the people and buy time. In this alternative history, I will change the situation so that Russia becomes a constitutional monarchy, where the Tsar is merely a nominal figure with limited powers. This is good, as his father did not teach him how to govern the country, and Nicholas II himself did not receive a proper education. Moreover, this will prevent Rasputin's influence, who made many decisions in Russia, as Nicholas II preferred to consult his wife rather than ministers on state governance. Rasputin and his wife were very close, and she often turned to him for advice. With the limited power of the Tsar, this will not happen. Another important point is that Nicholas II will not be able to directly take control of the army at the end of 1915, as the Constitution does not allow it. We have solved only one problem, but if the Great War begins as it did in reality, Russia may avoid the political mistakes that contributed to the rise of the Bolsheviks. However, the military situation has not improved. While establishing a constitutional monarchy is a simpler task, improving the military situation requires greater effort. I have a rather interesting proposal. Let's consider Russia's plans for the Great War. Plan 19. A was to be implemented if the main threat was Austria-Hungary, while Plan 19G was for the Germans. These plans were similar to the famous German Schlieffen Plan. If Plan 19A had been implemented, Russia would have stationed a large army in southern Poland to fight the weak Austro-Hungarian army, occupy Galicia, then the Carpathians, and advance to the Hungarian plains, capturing Budapest. According to this plan, there were to be enough Russian soldiers on the front against Germany to hold the lines. part of this plan was realized. As you might know, Russia captured part of Galicia, but never crossed the Carpathians and took Budapest. This happened because the French could lose Paris due to the Schlieffen Plan on the Western Front, and they asked Russia to attack German divisions in East Prussia to relieve pressure from France. As a result, instead of implementing one of the plans 19A or 19G, Russia tried to execute both, which only divided their attention and resources, and ultimately neither plan succeeded. Plan 19. A could have worked against Austria, and the book mentions how Budapest could have been captured, but I will consider this scenario later. For now, you only need to know this. The Russian military command turned out to be quite incompetent, and I will tell how their offensive in East Prussia went. The Russian army planned to attack the German divisions in East Prussia, and for this, troops under the command of General Pyotr Kamenev had to move east to meet the army of Alexander Samsonov, who was to attack north of Warsaw. Such strike operations, extending over more than 100 kilometers, require precise geographical coordination and strict adherence to timelines. The problem was that Russia remained in the last century. Radio communication was unreliable and susceptible to interception, allowing the Germans to learn about Russian plans in advance. Additionally, two Russian generals had no communication with each other, as they refused to talk. This was a consequence of Russia's failures in the Russo-Japanese War that occurred 9 years ago. This is why communication between the two generals, who needed precise interaction and coordination, was disrupted. They were forced to use a third party, headquarters in Petrograd, where the Germans also monitored their negotiations. As a result, the Germans learned about the Russian offensive even before their ally, France. It's no surprise that this offensive turned into a disaster for Russia. After the Battle of Tannenberg and immense losses, Russian General Alexander Samsonov decided to take his own life to resolve the issue. I believe it would have been more rational to place these two commanders on the same front line for the improvement of the Russian military situation. It was a common picture, but on a micro level, the situation was even worse. Despite the poor preparation I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Russia used a mix of domestic, American, Japanese, and British rifles, each of which used different types of ammunition. As a result, many soldiers had rifles and ammunition but could not use them. One soldier wrote in his memoirs that in a box of 30,000 artillery shells, only 200 were functional, which is only 0.67%. This is indeed a terrible indicator. The previously initiated industrialization could have benefited Russia, as it would have allowed for the creation of domestic factories producing standardized rifles and ammunition, significantly improving the situation at the front. It could also contribute to the improvement of the railway network, which was deliberately left underdeveloped in Poland to complicate the advance of the approaching army into the depths of Russia. However, conversely, it would also hinder the movement of Russian troops and supplies. Most likely, Russia should at least purchase equipment from one country, as domestic production could only solve the problem if corruption is excluded. Let's not forget that, due to corruption, at least half of the produced rifles will disappear, which may make future developments even more deadly. I believe that Russia should buy weapons and ammunition from one country while producing heavy equipment in its own factories. In any case, much more weaponry is needed, as Russia had 5 million mobilized soldiers and only 1,900,000 rifles. Thus, only 1 in 2 soldiers was armed, while the others remained unarmed. Soldiers did not use radios, and messages were delivered by horseback riders. Even worse, due to a lack of railways on the fronts against Austria-Hungary and Germany, soldiers had to march hundreds of kilometers, after which they were not allowed to rest and were immediately sent into battle. Вот одна шутка, которую русские солдаты рассказывали друг другу во время войны. Мы отступим к Уралу, и когда мы туда доберемся, количество врагов сократится до одного немецкого и одного австрийского солдата. Австрийский солдат сдастся, а мы убьем немца. Honestly, it was quite a good strategy that worked well for the Russians in World War II. Russia needs to improve its military thinking, which could happen if Alexei Bruylo had more power, possibly even if he were appointed the country's military general. Sir Bernard Montgomery recalled him as the only competent Russian general during World War I. The book states that he could have crossed the Carpathians and captured Hungary, but other military generals on his flank refused to support him. For example, Russian General Alexei A. He postponed his advance to support Brühl, claiming the weather was bad. General Sarikov also agreed to delay the advance into Austria-Hungary, which, of course, was a mistake. At this time, Brühl will not have as much power as before, but if he has more authority, it should lead to a more competent Russia, both militarily and economically. The last problem was that Russian soldiers were about 75% illiterate peasants, which of course increased numbers but did not contribute to creating good soldiers. When Russia had to retreat, the army looted its own villages and stole livestock. On the other hand, the lack of peasants led to hunger at home, which could have been prevented with more effective mobilization. Hey, I would like to buy a piece of bread, sir. That will be 1,000,000 rubles. What? But it's 1914, not 2024. Are we under sanctions? No, it's just expensive because all the farmers are at the front, and there is no food left in Russia. We have transformed Russia from a backward society that lost on every front and suffered into a more competent Russian empire. I understand that the backstory was quite long, but I hope this answer on how to improve Russia will satisfy you more than just early industrialization. This time, Russia is better prepared for conflict, and when the events of 1914 unfold, it will be able to execute its plan aimed at conquest. The book repeatedly mentions that such an invasion could have worked if the surrounding officers had supported Alex Breuil. This operation of Breuil really took place in history, from June 4th to September 20th, 1916, but it could have started at the very beginning of the conflict, almost 2 years earlier. Considering that all of the above would have been implemented, and taking into account how quickly and easily Austria-Hungary became part of Gaul in 1914, Breuil's offensive, had it occurred 2 years earlier, would indeed have had a chance to reach the Hungarian capital, Budapest. This could have potentially brought Austria-Hungary out of the war even before Serbia capitulated, while Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy joined the conflict. If this had happened, the war would have been shorter, leading to a milder peace treaty. I will describe how this peace treaty might look, and later I will explore the scenario of total war, where the conflict lasts for several years, which is also a real possibility. If there were a short war, and Russia could win, the Russians would gain several German provinces on the border, as well as all of Gaul. Serbia would receive Bosnia, and France would get Alsace. Germany might lose some of its colonies, but not all of them. Ultimately, Charles I, who was a liberal king, would be appointed head of Austria-Hungary, which could have led to the liberalization of the country and the creation of a Slavic crown. But you may wonder why the fall of Budapest would lead to the capitulation of Austria-Hungary. The reason is that the Hungarian part of the empire would feel threatened and would likely revolt against Austrian rule. As a result, Austria might surrender and lose Galicia and Bosnia, but keep Hungary. All of the above is very optimistic, but it would be possible if Russia had started industrialization earlier and had a competent army. In some cases, it is claimed that Germany would not declare war on Russia if the country is too strong, and I believe this is true. However, this does not stop Russia from entering the war, so Germany would really find itself in a difficult position in this scenario. The most realistic scenario is that Russia would simply hold the front at first, and when France requested help due to pressure on Paris, the Russians would attack East Prussia instead of Gaul. This would mean implementing Plan 19G instead of Plan 19A, but it is important not to carry out both plans simultaneously. Earlier, I mentioned the encirclement plan for East Prussia, which this time would be possible due to a clear schedule, better communication, and encrypted radio communication. I have no doubt that this would catch the Germans off guard, and there is a possibility that East Prussia could be surrounded. If you know geography, then you know that there is Königsberg, which is an important port city, so the German army could receive supplies through the Baltic Sea. The Russian fleet could have been used to support this, but considering how both sides were reluctant to use their warships in the war due to the high cost of construction, perhaps the Russians would allow the Germans to replenish supplies in this region. One way or another, I assume it would be very costly for Germany and would require the transfer of soldiers from the Western Front to the Eastern, which in turn would relieve pressure on France. If we are to be even more optimistic, the book mentions that the Schlieffen Plan was not fully realized, and had it been executed, Paris could have fallen. I mention this because the Germans did not protect their right flank, which was not a problem in history, but this time, with a weakened Germany and a strengthened France, encirclement in Belgium becomes possible. This could force Germany to retreat from Belgium and position its troops west of the M River, which would be yet another catastrophic loss. I will not delve into this possibility, as it would make the scenario less interesting, and I want the war to be exciting. On the Western Front, everything would remain the same, but on the Eastern Front, instead of Russia capturing Galicia, this time it would capture East Prussia. This is not too big of a difference, meaning that Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire would still enter the war on the side of the Central Powers. If Germany had been surrounded in Belgium, I don't think the war would have escalated and drawn in more countries, which contradicts my expectations, as it would have led to a quick war, making the video boring. Nevertheless, I have already mentioned what a peace treaty would look like in the case of a quick war. With the expansion of the Central Powers, Italy and Japan will join Dantan, and Romania will follow their example after the Russian offensive in Galicia, known as the Brusilov Offensive.